Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world, where you are watching live or you're watching this on the recordings that we put up on our website and on our Vimeo channel. So my name is Fuzz Kiddo, and with Carolyn Kiddo, we are the national co-directors of Be Slavery Free, Australian-based, but working in regions around the world. And tonight we are very pleased to have Laura Murphy as our guest. And as is our want and is what we ask people to do, if you'd like to introduce yourself, do so in the chat down the bottom there. It might be a chance for you to network, know who else is around, and make some contacts, and even send messages individually to people who are on the call. But because we are in Australia and is the Australian tradition, I'd like to recognise that we are on Aboriginal land and give respect and thanksgiving to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. And we would like to say to all First Nation people, wherever you're watching and listening to, that would recognise that they have a very important role and often have been the custodians of the land. So tonight is a special one because we've not had enough of these, which is about meeting the author. And so Anna, who's our wonderful co-worker, is going to introduce Laura to you now.
Thank you, Fuzz. Dr. Laura T. Murphy is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. She has been the recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, a British Academy Visiting Fellow, and the John G. Medlin Fellow at the National Humanities Centre. Professor Murphy's research is broadly interested in forced labour globally, with a particular interest in survivor narratives and first-person testimony. She has previously conducted research on forced labour in India, Nigeria, Ghana, the United States, and Canada. She is currently working on several research projects about the Chinese government's intertwined systems of internment and forced labour that has been inflicted on the people of the Uyghur Region. The work investigates the international supply chains that have ties to those repressive systems. Dr. Murphy has also written several books on slavery and slave narratives, and her latest book, Freedomville, Story of the 21st Century Revolt, tells the story of a small village of rock quarry miners in Sombasa in India and their revolution, which leads to their freedom from bonded labor. Welcome, Dr. Murphy. We are so glad to have you with us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. This is really great.
Now, before we start, in a superhero movie, an audience would get a montage of the background story of the hero, a glimpse of the experiences that impact the hero and compel them to do their hero work. So tonight, let's just pretend that you are the superhero. What is your origin story? How did you first come into contact with modern slavery? What made you decide that you wanted to devote your life to the issues of modern slavery?
Oh, thanks. That's a really fun way to frame that question. Thanks. I should put it out there that I don't have any superpowers unless it's writing, and everybody can do that. But I like that way of thinking about it. So yeah, I grew up in Louisiana. In southern Louisiana in the United States. And I guess one of the things I often say is that when I was a young person, slavery and the history of slavery was sort of central to the way, to history that we were taught in school. There was no, there are states in the United States where people hide the history of slavery. There's no way to hide it in Louisiana. It's on the landscape. It's everywhere you look. We went to plantations, on school field trips and saw the beautiful homes that the wealthy used to have, used to live in. And it's funny that you framed it as a hero narrative, because I guess partially as a young person, because of the way slavery was taught, but it was taught as a story about the the rise and fall of the Louisiana, the Southern economy in a way. And you know, I remember going on tour only maybe 10 years ago where there was a tour guide who told us about the glory days of slavery, when the family who lived in this house had all this wealth and had these beautiful parties. And then we turned a corner and he said, and the Civil War came, and now we're going to show you the time when things were not so great. And I said, for who? Like really loud and screamed it, right? But like, because of the way that story is told, when you grow up in, when I grew up, at least in Louisiana, in the 80s, you know, as a white person, you had this idea that you would be on the good side. You would have been one of the abolitionists. You would have been one of the people. I imagine myself kicking down doors and helping people be free and this kind of thing. I mean, it's a ridiculous narrative, but this is how it's framed as, you know, like a sort of guilt-free hero possibility. You know, I'm so glad you framed it this way. I've never thought about it this way. And so I really did think about it. That I would have been one of the good guys. Surely I would not have been one of the people who held slaves. And had my family held slaves, I would have been somebody who would have fought against it, right? So this is the idea you have of yourself. And so in 2004, I suppose, I went to a presentation and people talking, oh no, I didn't. I read an article in the New York Times Magazine. I was prepping for my exams. This issue of slavery was so important to me that that's what I studied for my PhD. I was doing my comprehensive exams, which meant that I had to read 200 books and do an exam for 2 hours, and people could ask me anything about any of those 200 books. And I was, a big section of them, a quarter of those books were slave narratives. And so I was just sitting there all day, just reading slave narratives, cover to cover, prepping for this exam. And the article compared someone, by the way, my computer just said my internet is unstable, and this is not my own house. So if you just interrupt me if it's not connecting, okay? Don't worry, I'm a teacher, I'm used to being interrupted. So I'm reading this article, and it compares people who are exploited laborers to people in the hold of a slave ship. And I was furious. I mean, I was just so angry that anybody would imagine it in an analogy. But I kept reading this article, and the more I read, the more I realized, wait, hang on a second, though. This meets the threshold for slavery. I don't think that this analogy to the slave ship is okay, but I think that like people are being forced to work. They're being forced migrated across long distances. Of course, not everybody who's enslaved has that experience, but this is the story that I was reading about at the time. They're being forced to migrate across long distances. They're being forced to work without anybody paying them. This is slavery. And it just turned a dial in my head. And I thought, I'm studying all this historical slavery, and I'm doing nothing about this thing that's happening now. And it's very clear. And I had always thought I would be the one who would fight it. And here I am, just like pretending like it's a thing of the past. So a total switch was turned in my head, and my entire life changed at that point. I'm a good girl. So I finished my dissertation on the history of slavery. And, you know, I stayed on the path and finished my exams and did everything. But then all of my work since then has been on contemporary forms of forced labor.
Great. That's such a, I can hear the passion coming through that this is something that is your hero work. This is something that you are going to devote your life to. So this book about Freedomville, as I understand it, there was already quite a lot of publicity around the story of these rock quarry miners in India, and that there was a little film out, and it was kind of the poster child example of how revolutions were supposed to happen. Is that right? Am I getting this narrative right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's absolutely right. So
in that context of having already quite a bit of publicity, and you were teaching about this Freedomville village, what actually made you want to write a whole narrative about it? I mean, why go write a book on Freedomville when there was already stuff about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It wouldn't have been something that I would have done necessarily, because, as you said, there had been some significant press on this very small group of people. We're talking the main core of the people are about 30 people, you know, about maybe 10 families, maybe it's about 50 people. The people who staged the revolt, maybe about 500 people total. And this had been in a movie made by Free the Slaves. And it was one of the first things and contemporary slavery, and helped me to understand that people had, you know, that people were doing sort of grassroots organizing, and that, you know, the very people who were oppressed were rising up and were successfully taking back the means of production. These folks had gotten their own quarry. They were working for themselves. They were sending their kids to school. And this is the story, like this can happen. And I think that, you know, the Free the Slaves model was really interesting at the time. So they were a brand new organization, and their basic premise was like, we don't need to decide from the top down what people should do on the ground. They're already freeing themselves. Let's figure out how to funnel money from, you know, from wealthier nations and wealthier people to build the capacity of people who are doing it on the ground. And so they had identified this group of folks in India who were helping like the most impoverished people get leases. And these were impoverished people helping impoverished people, but they were helping them get free, and the communities were helping each other get free and then get their own leases to rock quarries, which was the work that they were doing. They were already doing rock quarry working. And you'd think, well, let's get them a more lucrative career. Let's get them something that will have social mobility. But in fact, this was what they knew how to do. And they were hoping to get social mobility for their children. But for the people who were already working in the rock quarries, they worked in the rock quarries because that's what they knew how to do. That's what they knew how to sell. That, you know, they knew that market. It was a beautiful model for self-liberation. And I think that's a super important aspect, right? That people were liberating themselves. It wasn't this hero story. It wasn't Liam Neeson kicking down the doors and throwing girls over his shoulder and running out and shooting guns in the air and this shit. That's not real. And so, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this show, but I just did, sorry. So anyway, so this is the story that I've been told. I taught this to my classes. It was something that really animated my thinking about work, because I think that about work in general, but about the work of the anti-slavery movement. I think a lot of people think that rescue is the work of anti-slavery, and I think that's a real mistake. And I think it does have this sort of white savior, historical, like hero narrative to it. And I think that that's how a lot of people link up to the history of slavery. But in fact, the vast majority of people in all of human history who've escaped slavery do it on their own 2 feet, right? They don't sit around and wait for some white person to come carry them out, right? So I thought this was a really important model for rethinking that rescue narrative. Great. So telling the story, wrote about it myself, had listened to all these transcripts of the audio that the Free the Slaves took when they did the documentary. But then I decided, well, let me, you know, like it just so happened that I was going to India for a totally different purpose. And I said, let me see if I can get myself to Uttar Pradesh and go see these folks and see how they're doing now. Because we hadn't heard anything from them in 10 years. And I wasn't sure, like, I know that Free the Slaves had helped them for a while and that other organizations had helped them, but you know, what's next for them? So I go to meet them in 2014, and the story that they told was completely different. And this is why this book exists, because I tell the story that we all knew, and that, you know, the vast majority of that story is totally true. But one significant difference was revealed when I sat down to talk to the people that day. A very old lady, I mean, just tiny, old, wrinkled lady, starts talking animatedly and just screaming and talking and trying to get her story in. And I don't know Hindi, and I had a translator. The translator was very good, and she just kept missing things. And I was like, tell me what she said. What did she say? She keeps hacking her hand, like an axe into her hand. Like, tell me what she said. And she said, well, she said, and then we beat and we beat and we beat them. And I was like, what do you mean we beat and we beat and we beat them? She's like, oh yeah, they killed them. And I was like, they killed who? Who got killed? And it came out that they had not just had what had been touted as a nonviolent, silent revolution. It hadn't been silent or nonviolent at all. That in fact, they had gone to this rally with the intention of killing the people who had been holding their families in bondage for generations. And the violence and the tension had gotten too high, and they had been, there had been rapes of several young girls, and they were like, that's it, we're gonna kill them. And so they went to the mine with the very tools that they used to break rocks and broke people's skulls. And so this murder ends up sort of forming the center of the book, that like, what do we do about how we tell stories, how we consume people's stories and present them to the world as the anti-slavery movement? What are the outcomes for people who commit violent revolutions instead of nonviolent? What does it mean when we valorize nonviolence but ignore violence? So there were just a lot of questions that I really struggled with. So I went back several times over the next couple of years and sat with them and talked with them, talked with the people who had been, I talked to one of the people who was really maimed in the melee. You don't get to use that word very often, melee. So. But so yeah, like one of the and the family of the people, but there was one guy who was killed and 3 dudes who were maimed, and see, I just used it in the passive voice again. I met one of the men that they murdered, and I met 3 men, or I met one of the men of the 3 that they maimed. But we always said it in the passive voice like that. So it took away the agency of these folks who went to kill them because we're afraid of talking about that. And so I wanted to tell that story and think more carefully about that.
So there's a chapter in your book called NGOification of the revolution, and I think this is what you're getting at. Did you have any further comments on that? Like, what, I mean, we are an NGO. I mean, a lot of people who are going to be watching this, who are watching this, they work in this sector, and we tell a lot of stories. We tell a lot of people's stories and victims and survivors, and we bring awareness, and we become the hero of the story in a lot of times. So how do we stop NGOifying these stories, and how do we do this in a more genuine way that really gives back people their agency and their voice?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think that, we can't not tell these stories. I've read a ton of research that suggests that people, for whatever reason, I don't entirely get it, aren't moved by hearing that 40 million people are enslaved, but they are moved by hearing that Sally is enslaved, or Lulu is enslaved, or Kofi is enslaved, right? This I find super weird, even though I work on first person narrative as my own work. I find it super strange, but people are moved by the stories, by understanding what happened to individuals or small communities, like the people of Freedomville. And I guess there are a few things that are really important. One, that is that we get permission from the people whose stories we tell. And of course, Free the Slaves did have permission of the people. They knew what was going on. They wanted the word to get out. There was a real campaign to get media and get international attention to this model that they were building for self-liberation and taking back the means of production. It's amazing. And so they along with people like sort of a multi-caste coalition were working to get the word out. So this is fine. We have to tell the stories as they tell them, though. One of the things that is important is that I think often we appropriate, and I've written a good deal about this, so if you're interested in this, I have a book called The New Slave Narrative, the battle over the representation of contemporary slavery, because I do think that there's a battle over representation, and often the politics of people who are enslaved get suppressed because we appropriate their stories within the movement to reflect the politics we want to engage in, and that silences the politics that might be coming from people who are former forced laborers. So this goes back. This has probably always happened. I mean, Frederick Douglass talked about how William Lloyd Garrison thought that he was the politics, that William Lloyd Garrison was the politics, and that Frederick Douglass was merely the experience, that he used him just as an example, not as an intellectual who had ideas. And so they split over like a divide on what the Constitution should say about slavery. And this is a really instructive moment, I think, historically for us who are working on slavery now. And that is that, you know, the people who we're working with who are survivors are themselves intellectuals with lived experience and expertise, and also like, you know, theoretical expertise, political expertise. They're navigating this world just like we are and figuring out what they believe. And I think we often just silence their politics. So, you know, I write a whole lot about how sometimes survivor narratives get appropriated to condone war, to arm civil war groups, to you know, with unbeknownst to the people whose stories, you know, like this Joseph Kony thing. Joseph Kony, bad guy, terrible. But like the stuff that those folks were using that money for, nobody knew. No, you know, like, and all these kids were just sending all this cash to I'm not gonna say their names, but the, you know, and that money goes to like an attempt to try to stage a coup in a country that none of these people have ever been to, and you know, so these, and a lot of it goes towards Islamophobia, it goes to anti-sex work. I mean, there's a lot of nefarious politics in the anti-slavery movement, and people's stories just get co-opted. So it's important that we don't do that. And I mean, the really terrible things like that happen. What happened with the Free the Slave story? I think that these folks really did kind of try to hide their complicity in the murder. There was a 10-year court battle. They, you know, they had a lot to protect. So they didn't want to have it all over the news that they like went after these folks with axes, you know? So the story, we also have to recognize that stories change and that people may want a different story told. And that doesn't mean that they lied at any point. It doesn't mean that we can't trust survivors. It means that there are different scenarios in which different parts of our stories are operational or operative, or what's the word I'm looking for? And we all do that. But for some reason, when survivors tell a different story, when their story changes, when they add details, they get completely treated as if they are just liars and cannot be trusted. And like anomalous in human experience, when in fact that is the norm for human experience. I'm not telling you all of my business right now. And so, you know, and I probably never will tell you all my business, but if it became crucial for my survival or to help other people, I might tell you more of my business, right? And so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn. And if you just take a second to Google or search, I'm agnostic about which search engine you use, but if you decided to internet search human trafficking or modern slavery right now and just go to images, the images you see are images of people who have hands over their mouths, who have their hands tied, who are being silenced, who are helpless, who cannot help themselves, and also happen to typically be beautiful white girls, which is not really the demographic of the most, you know, the people who receive the most harm in our world. And so what we see when we look at a lot of, especially new organizations, when they really want to get the word out about their anti-slavery work, we often see them exploiting these exploitative images and not recognizing that people who are enslaved have agency, that sometimes they need to better understand what their rights are, no question, but that we are not their saviors, that these are not largely wealthy white girls who are getting kidnapped by, I don't know who, nefarious, you know, brown others like that. I just really have a bone to pick with Liam Neeson because he's kind of ruined our lives in a way. Not Liam Neeson himself, I guess, but that movie. And so he's really messed up for us. But like the messaging is terrible. But like we, you know, like but a lot of organizations replicate that savior narrative, that deracialized context for violence in our culture, and also like the like they reinforce a sense that people don't have agency and can't help themselves, and all of these things I think are really, really deeply problematic, and I think we can do better.
You've given us a lot to think about. Be Slavery Free does not use images like that with chains and locks and padlocks, and that's one of our pet peeves. So we are very, very careful about the images that we do use. I guess with the personal narratives, though, there is something about being able to connect on a personal level. I think you referred to the 40 million people being, trapped in slavery and how that sometimes doesn't move people. And I think a part of the reason is that it's so overwhelming. Like, what is 40 million people? That's more than the population of all of Australia. And
right.
Like, as an individual, it's so hard to connect with that. And whereas an individual, I can connect. So
yeah,
I don't know what question I was going to ask about that, but I guess
that's okay. I have things to say about that too.
As I was reading your book and I was coming to the end of it, and realizing, there is no happy ending that I was looking for these people. In, spoiler alert, there's no rainbow and unicorns at the end of the story for the people of Freedomville. But there was a sense of disappointment for me, because I was getting invested in these people's lives and wanting them to have that freedom. What can I do? What can people like me do to channel that disappointment in a way that's actually fruitful, in a way that's actually going to make a difference? I mean, that's not savior mentality. That's not like I'm from the West and I'm going to save these people, but like, what can we actually do? Like,
we have to do something.
Yeah, we have to do something. So what can we do?
No, I think that's a fair concern, that it does feel intractable at times. It feels too big to sort of wrap your head around, and a lot of times having a particular place, a particular moment, a particular group of people, a particular individual even makes it easier for us to think, okay, what would this person need? And I think that's important work. I do think we need to think about that, and we need to like send out surveys and do research and find out what people actually need. Like, one of the things we don't have a lot of, for instance, is long-term outcome research. There are very few longitudinal studies of survivors and what happens to them 10 years, 15 years on. And that's one of the things that makes this book maybe a letdown, because what happens when you go back 15 years later, they're still extraordinarily poor. They're still dying of tuberculosis. Spoiler alert, sorry. They're I know, and they're still, they're still struggling to make ends meet, and the government is still holding them back. And there's new regimes of power that are not based in slavery, but that still nonetheless are holding people back. And I think that for me, and this may not be for everyone, but I just tweeted this actually the other day, like, almost everything I do in the world, and I said everything good, but almost everything I do, even the bad stuff, is driven by rage. Like that anger, it's true. I mean, the anger, I've been like a ball of rage since I was a child. Like I don't remember a time when I wasn't just furious. This is how we do, right? Like, you shake it off and you dance in the street, you walk your dog, you take care of yourself. But deep inside of me, I am a ball of rage. And it's, in a lot of ways, it feeds my action. So knowing that the folks at Freedomville left one, so on the one hand, I want to say that there's extraordinary hope that let's flip it. Let me do the negative first, and then I'll end with the hope, and then we can move from there. Maybe this will make you feel better, but which isn't the point, but still, like, but so on the one hand, it's true that there are I will just say it outright. The authoritarian Modi government has discriminated against Muslims, has made violence sort of a core of the politics in the region, and the people I write about, the Adivasi people, are sort of caught in the midst of being not quite within the caste system, but not Muslim, and so like, they are being left behind in a lot of ways, but also live in the midst of this extremely tense, extremely violent scenario. They were also left behind during COVID, which doesn't factor into the book, because the book was being published, while COVID was going on, was being completed. But I know that they struggled during COVID as well. That and Adivasi people all over northern India were like had to like leave these horrible working conditions, many of them trafficked, to like walk back thousands of miles to their hometowns for COVID, many of them dying. I mean, just horrible things are occurring to these folks, and they're dispossessed. And so even as they gain some momentum, some change, some rights, some social mobility, it's still very difficult for them. The good side, though, is that I do see a real sea change happening. While I was there in India, some really different, some really big changes were going on over the 5 years that I followed the people of Freedomville. So, for instance, you know, really in many ways, for a lot of these bonded laborers who had transgenerational debt that was holding them in bondage, in, you know, basically in slavery, that system has really dissipated. It's not gone, but it is diminished significantly. More people get a minimum wage. The minimum wage is not enough. And people take, you know, contractors who get the work of these folks often take a bit off the top as a fee. So like there's all kinds of abuses, but the money goes directly to their phones. They have bank accounts. Sometimes people rob their bank accounts, like steal their, like terrible things still happen because they're illiterate, they're innumerate, but many more of them are getting education. I would see children, girls riding bikes to school in the morning, all their hair perfectly combed and ready, not going to work, not covered in dust, not, I talked, for instance, one scene that I had to cut out of the book that I try to tell every time I can, because I really liked this moment, and I really like this guy, was a bartender in the hotel that I stayed in. I wasn't really, as a woman, I wasn't really like, there weren't other women in bars, but I just didn't know what to do. After a long day, I would go, and I admit I would sit and I would have a single beer at this bar by myself. There was like basically no one else there. And there was a bartender there who was really nice. He happened to come from a long family of farm owners. His family owned land. He owned this farm. His dad was dead, but he hated being a farmer. So he would bus in from the farm every day and bartend at this hotel where he got to talk to people who came in from all over, and and he really was area. And he told me one day a story about how his dad had been a farmer, and how when his dad, once I started telling him about what I was working on, he said his dad had never paid the workers, that was not part of the arrangement. They got to live on the land, and they took out debt. Sometimes he gave them loans. So he held people in debt bondage, his dad. And he said, I can't even fathom that. Of course I pay them. I have to pay them. It's the law. And so in one generation, now, again, he's not paying them the full amount, but they switched from just an assumption that you would never pay Adivasi people for their work to, I should mention, because in the Australian context, this might make more sense too. These folks are the Adivasis are the indigenous people of this region, and they use the word Adivasi because it means indigenous, essentially. It means like of the land or something. But then the technical term for them are tribal peoples. That's the technical term that the government uses. So when you see people talking about scheduled castes and tribes, they're among the tribal people, but they use the term Adivasi, which is the term I'll use. So in a single generation, this was changing. And so people were getting minimum wage. The idea that people should work for nothing was diminishing among both the people who had not paid people and the people who had not been paid. So this was a major change. Now, there was also a legacy of paternalistic thinking in which the people who used to not have to pay anybody was like, but wasn't it better back then when we didn't pay anybody? Then we were all such good friends, and now there's so much tension. This is also a historical thing that we see in cases of slavery all around, where the people who are slaveholders, when they're, when slavery is over, when it's not allowed anymore, well, that's when we turned into the dark times, right? That's when we go to the time when the South was poor and everybody, like this kind of thing seems to be a universal among people who are the beneficiaries of slavery.
Mm.
But that, you know, the thing that I think is positive is that these changes do happen, but we have to understand them as a marathon. We cannot think of them as a sprint. We cannot think we're just going to go in again, scoop girls up and run out, right? Because even look at that scene in Liam Neeson. I don't know why I'm bringing this up so much, but like that scene, he looks around, he throws like one white girl over his shoulder and leaves all those other girls, you know, like I don't know, like all these other girls, like ambiguously racialized others, all just caught up in some cells with locks and then with rapists everywhere. But, oh, I got my white daughter, you know. It's like so like when we have that kind of mentality, we leave a whole lot of people behind. But these sort of systemic changes are really what drives actual change, and really is what is this foundation of people becoming free. And that's what we need to be working towards, is these sort of real systemic changes. So we need to have a living wage for people all over the world. We need to ensure that people have, reasonable housing, access to reasonable housing, have access to water and basic utilities, have jobs that have dignity. These are things that we need to be working for, not like the rescue of one child, which is important, but the sort of systemic things that will support that child once they're out. And so that, I think, is one of the big lessons here, and one that is, I think, hopeful, and that reminds us that there isn't a happy ending that happens all at once, that it's a long, 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 long process of like slow change to get people rights and to get ourselves out of the way of those rights.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. That's music to our ears, because that's kind of the work that Be Slavery Free does. We really do try to change laws and, bring awareness about the systemic changes that are needed to sustain change and revolutions. So thank you for that. I did kind of want to pivot a little bit onto the research that you are currently doing. I know that you were doing some research about the Uyghur people, and we've been very interested in what's happening in the Xinjiang region. So did you want to talk a little bit about what you're finding there, what you're researching, and, the lowdown?
Yeah, I'd love to. And talk about a situation that feels intractable, like you can't do anything. Like imagine. I mean, this is what it is for those of you who maybe are new to this issue. The Chinese government, the People's Republic of China's government, has put upwards of 1 million people into internment camps. They have a system of forced labor that they call labor transfers and surplus labor, which they do in the guise of poverty alleviation. And they have transferred 2.5 million minoritized citizens. And I say minoritized because these folks are not actually in the minority in the region they're from. They're just treated as a minority by Han colonial settlers that have come out in waves in the last 50 years, but significantly in the last 10. And so these minoritized people are being put in these internment camps, and there's a concomitant system of forced labor. Some of the forced labor happens within the camps, so people are assigned to do work within the internment camps. But there's also a program in which labor agents of the state are sent door to door, like literally door to door, to knock on every single person's house and say, who here is going to come and work for this system? They target primarily people who they deem to be unemployed or underemployed, but that involves all farmers. And this is a very farming centered economy. And so the vast majority of people in southern Xinjiang are farmers. So every farmer is deemed to be surplus labor. They want to mechanize the farming industry. They cooperatize people's land and take it away from them, and then say, oh, well, now you're unemployed. You're going to have to go work in a factory because you can't be unemployed. You can't be a modern citizen and be unemployed. Well, the government just tore down their house and took their land over. That's how they got to be unemployed, right? And now they're like, okay, you have to go work at a factory. So people don't have a choice as to whether or not they do this. Government policy has said that anybody who resists a poverty alleviation placement is deemed infected by terrorism, and therefore can go to the camps. And so essentially, there is no opportunity to say no. Everyone there, because there are only about 12 million Uyghur and other minoritized citizen community groups, people. So that grammatically didn't work, but you know what I mean. There are only about 12 million people who are from these groups. And so like 1.5 million of them, that's, you know, 7, 8, 10%, 1 in 10 people are in these camps. So everyone knows someone who's in a camp. Most people have a family member who's in a camp. They know what's going on there. It's rape, it's torture, it's horrible. It's constant interrogation, constant ideological training, discipline beyond anything you can imagine. And then once you get out, you're treated as if you were a criminal, even though this is an extrajudicial system. People have not committed crimes. They're sent in there for pre-crimes, for the possibility that they might be radicalizable. So those folks then have a mark that is actually like on a QR code on their phone that says that they are not trustworthy, and now they can't get jobs, they can't go anywhere, they can't leave their town. I mean, it's just a horrific system. And then the government is like, okay, well, we're going to put you to work right here next to your house. And those people who we deem trustworthy, we're going to send to a factory further away. And people can't say no because the consequences to go into the camps and have their entire lives taken away from them. So what I've been trying to do is work with a team of people who work on supply chains. We can't go to that region right now. Like no one can, like journalists who've gone out there have gotten beaten up. You have a follower that I used to live out there even in 2004, 2005, when I lived there. There were people who followed us. There were people, we had minders, you know, friends of ours like walked into their room one day and found the police on their computer. Like this is it's the police state for decades, but now it is intense and it's very frightening. And so you can't get access to factories, you can't get access to workers. So we can't really go there and do the kind of worker voice, first person testimony work that we would usually do. So I had to turn to tracing supply chains, which I never imagined my life becoming a person who traces supply chains. But I just like stare at my computer all day, like looking through shipping records and like trying to find matches and trying to find how to connect the dots between the products that are being made in these factories in Xinjiang and elsewhere by Uyghur forced laborers out to our own supply chain. So I did a report that came out in May that was about the solar panel industry and how much of the precursors to those modules are made in Xinjiang, but also now I've got a report coming out November 3rd that's about the apparel industry and how those products are getting to us, and it names 105 brands, many of which we all shop for. You know, they're like kind of the regular fast fashion brands. So the other thing I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to figure out how to buy used clothes, and more importantly, used electronics. Like I don't even know how to get like a phone cable or new headphones or things like that. So some of my time is spent doing that when I need a new thing, trying to figure out how to avoid buying things from that region because it is so dire that I can't even do it. No, that's what I'm working on now.
Okay. Well, you've given us some ideas about buying used clothing and used electronics. Carolyn, did you have anything to add? Your microphone.
So we met Laura over a conversation around supply chains, which I think it was meant to go for 45 minutes and it went for an hour and a half or 2 hours. But but I just wanted to I guess offer some feedback. In that time, Laura was finishing off her solar panels report, and it's a very good report. I mean, that tracing of supply chains that she did is extraordinary work. And I don't like tracing supply chains either, Laura. But I've been in, as a result of that report, I think everyone in the construction, most people in the construction industry in Australia have read that report, and they're kind of going, oh my gosh, we're on this big move for climate change. And this report kind of says to us, well, you can get your climate change for cheap and participate in modern slavery, or you can pay for your climate change and not have modern slavery. And they're going, tell us how you make that decision. And usually my response is, how difficult is that decision to make? You know,
right? Like spend one sleepless night just really thinking about it, okay?
Yeah.
I'm glad you're putting it that way, because I think a lot of people, when people first read the report, one of the things that came up was this rhetoric of, now we have to make a choice between rights and the planet. And I'm like,
yeah,
no, we don't. No, we need to pay a little bit more to buy from companies that are actually doing this responsibly.
Yeah.
We need to ask those companies to invest in doing this more responsibly. We need to ask our governments and our, like our finance institutions to invest in doing this more responsibly. Now it will take a couple of years to build up more capacity, but last October, the solar energy industry discovered that they had this Xinjiang issue. They announced it, I think because they were pressed to do it because they knew news was about to come out. So they wanted to get ahead of it, which I thought was cool. And so last October, I read an article that was the Solar Energy Industry Association in the United States announcing to the world, we know a lot of our products are being made in Xinjiang. This has only occurred in the last 5 years. The Chinese government has put all kinds of incentives into moving that industry out there and holding it captive. China makes like 80% of the world's polysilicon, which goes into the panels that we use. So they've been very studiously capturing this market. The solar energy industry knows that. They announced it in October. And this October, a year later, they're like, we just don't know what to do. We're going to have to spend 1.5 years building capacity. I was like, if you had started that the day you announced this, we would be a year in and we would have 6 months left before we would have the expanded capacity. And some of those companies did do it. They quietly expanded capacity, quietly built new factories, because still what companies are trying to do is compete. And the thing that is galling me lately is that there's a real attempt to continue this rhetoric that that this whole problem is pitting human rights against the planet, and the planet's situation is urgent. And I submit to you that the thing that's most urgent to most of these people is profit. And so, like, if it were so urgent, then we would have started building capacity a year ago, and not just the companies that had enough money. They would have been saying, it doesn't matter if the money goes to us or not, the government needs to invest in this because we need to build this capacity quickly because the planet is urgent. No, it was profit that was urgent. So they were quiet about building capacity. They were quietly getting the government to give them money. They were right and not out there doing the work to really say, this is an urgent human rights issue and it's an urgent planetary issue, like climate issue. We need to manage both, right? And that's what I want to say. We need to have these things go hand in hand. I think that there is a logic of white supremacy that rests on urgency when it's most useful. So to capital. So, it's the planet's situation is urgent because that is going to get them what they want. But that ignores the urgency of the rights violations of people of color all around the world. So there are indigenous people being moved off their land for these massive solar farms. It doesn't show up in my backyard as a rich white person. It shows up in poor indigenous lands all over the world. The polluting of that the polysilicon plants do. Where does that get put? That gets put in poor indigenous people's backyards, not in my backyard. So these are concerns that if we're going to have a just transition, and I really like that language, we're going to have a just transition to a green economy. It has to be like we have to imagine the urgency of rights at the same time as we think about the urgency of the planet. Both those things are important, and we can do both. It just costs a little bit more money. And we have to do that. Governments and investment banks. I mean, I'm talking to people who are like, we hold $9 billion in capital for our investments. And I'm like, why are you even talking to me? And we're talking about a 10% markup sometimes. Like, just pay for the stuff that doesn't involve forced labor. So I have very little patience with this stuff. And so I'm glad we're all on the same team here.
Well, I just want you to know, Laura, that it is changing, and some of the big investment and construction companies in Australia are saying we're just going to have to pay more.
Good.
So and that's good. And for anyone who's sitting there thinking, well, I don't work in a construction company, so what could I do? You can jump onto our website and sign the petition where we're asking for the Australian government to introduce trade bans on goods made by forced labour. That's something that you can do right now. That will probably be in the House of Reps before the end of the year, depending on everything else. So
there is a question in the Q&A that we need to ask also.
So we need to ask this question. So hi, Joseph. So Joseph's question, and I think if I'm right, Joseph's from Poland, because he's been on some of our webinars before. So are the whites in the south of the US still in denial about their slavery history? And does that influence how they vote?
Yeah. Yeah. So the short answer is they're not only in denial of the history of slavery, but of the legacy of slavery, and that's what influences how they vote, right? And I say they. I still own a house in southern Louisiana and New Orleans. I still vote in the United States, even though my job is in the UK. But I will say that, like, the narrative is changing. More and more teachers, right? But not just me, an army of people who have been taught by people who recognize the history of slavery and understand it better. So there is more awareness of the history of slavery, as well as the legacies of slavery, which include radical inequality, poor schools, poor housing, poor food security for Black people in the South and all over the United States. More and more people are recognizing that, but because it behooves white people to maintain power, like it's in their best interest to stay in power and to maintain that inequality. And that inequality means just unfathomable profits for businesses, but profits that are at levels that nobody ever imagined, that are just historically outrageous. While at the same time, housing prices, for like even the lowest level housing prices being entirely inaccessible, whether we're talking about renting or owning. So people just consolidating wealth, white people consolidating wealth. This is important, right? This is important to them. And so they want to maintain that. So yeah, they vote like that. They tried that. I mean, there's a whole movement to stop having people talk about the legacy of slavery and racialized injustice in the United States. In this thing, I don't know if you've heard about this, like anti-critical race theory movement in the United States. Like I was trained in critical race theory. My degree is in African studies, and like this was never a thing I would ever imagine a Southern politician would have in their mouths. Like they would ever even have heard of critical race theory. Is just blows me away. Of course, they know nothing about critical race theory. They know nothing about what they're talking about, but they're out there trying to get it dismantled, taken out of our schools. And by that, they really mean, like, nobody's teaching like legal theory in an elementary school or high school. What they mean is we don't want young people to actually learn about the systemic inequality in this country. And so, people vote to try to maintain that power. They change education systems to try to maintain that power. But it is, I think that, again, I believe in the long game. I believe in education. I believe people like me. This is why I like being a professor. I like teaching. Because that's like a captive audience who I can train to understand how the world actually works. And they go out into the world and teach children and work in hospitals and do all the things that have to be out there to make this world more just. So I think it's getting better, but yeah, Joseph, bleak reality. It's true.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm telling you, just a few years ago, these plantation tours were still saying, I haven't gone in a few years, but they were still saying things like, these were the years of glory. And, like talking about the place settings on the table that they used and the dresses that went, and they put, like one one little bit about here's slavery in the corner, you know, like you can go to this house out here and learn about what slavery was like, because that's the trend. But a lot of places still just tell the story of one white rich family. It's real.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for that. It's been absolutely fascinating. You're a delight to listen to, and we could listen to you much, much longer than this. But you have given information, but sometimes it's those stories which create space between the information, the statistics, etc., in which we touch humanity to humanity, and allows us to actually grab a sense of that understanding that we're all human beings, and if we do this to each other, then we're not going to have a future, or what sort of future are we really going to have? So thank you so much for coming on tonight. We'd love to have you back again and to talk more in this area. Anna, excellent interviewing, and this was Anna's first, so she cracked it really, really well. And so thank you, and thank you everybody for being on. And just a reminder that there is a child labour webinar, the last one, and that's coming up. Anna, when is it again?
November 25th. So it'll be the last Thursday of November, 8 p.m. And it will be a conversation between Faz, Carolyn, and Arti Kapoor, just reflecting on what we have learned so far about child labour, the issues, the root causes, the remediation, the steps forward, and dreaming, I think, hopefully dreaming about what the future can look like. So that's November 25th. You can register on our website, beslaveryfree/child labour, and I'll send out those links when the recording goes out.
Great. And what we're going to be looking at there is the action of what we can be doing about it. So through that series, we've been working, particularly in this year, in the International Year of the Great Concentration on Child Labour. And so we've done what is, and listened in the last webinar to children around the world about what they think about child labour, which was absolutely fascinating, and a great webinar that's up on our Vimeo channel as well. And but this now we'll get into, so what can we do? What are the practical things that we can do to actually action this? So again, Laura, thank you so much. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody, for being a part of it. And we look forward to working on this together and making a different world a much, much better one. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.